Here we go. Everybody enjoys photos of hummingbirds, either taking them or seeing them. Our speaker is an environmental advocate who specializes in taking photos of birds. He has judged photo contests, conducted photo classes, and published books that show his photos. He's also a poet with a PhD in chemical engineering who writes with fountain pens, drives a hybrid car, and cooks great dinners. Today, he will show us how to take photos of hummingbirds. Please welcome photographer, author, and senior citizen Steve Kaye. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, thank you, Miguel. Hello and welcome, everybody. In fact, welcome to the wild, weird, wacky world of hummingbird photography. Certainly, hummingbirds are fascinating. They can fly normal speeds as fast as 30 miles an hour, unless the male is showing off during breeding, and then he'll go into dives at 60 miles an hour. Their wings beat at 60 to 70 beats per second. They weigh, at least the ones in our area, weigh 3 to 4 grams. And that means that if you could somehow fit 7 of them in a number 10 envelope, you could mail that for a single stamp. I want to mention, I took all the photos that you're going to see, and these are real, live, wild birds. So none of my photos were taken in zoos, bookstores, or museums. And, live birds is more challenging. I'll admit at the beginning, hummingbird photography can be difficult. They're small, they're fast, they're wild, and yet the results can be worth it. I want to begin by covering 5 important concepts and tips. So here are things that you will need if you're going to take photos of hummingbirds. And the first is acceptance. There are times when there's no bird, or there are times when the bird does something that defies explanation, or maybe the bird is tired and taking a nap. So candidly, hummingbird photography is an exercise in failure. That means you're going to eat failure for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You're going to roll around in failure. You'll go outside, stand on the street and announce, "I love failure." And your neighbors will hear that and say, "Oh, there's somebody who takes photos of hummingbirds." So what's the trick? You overwhelm failure with effort. You take lots and lots of photos. In fact, you take so many photos that you're comfortable throwing out good ones, and that's because you have better photos. I'm putting the settings on the bottom for many of the photos. Another thing we need is respect, and that means cause no damage. Go through the environment in a way that takes care of it. And that's because if this bird's alive, you can come back and take more photos of it. The third thing we need is optimism. That means you go out expecting or just believing that there's always something. Oh, wait, you may not find a hummingbird, but you might find an orange-crowned warbler. Or maybe you'll find a lesser goldfinch. Or maybe you'll find a yellow-eyed junco. Wait a minute. Hey, that's really a special bird. You're going to have to go into Southeast Arizona to find that one. But I took this photo at the Santa Rita Lodge in Madera Canyon, which is southeast of Tucson. An important point is we take photos, and that's because any photo is better than no photo. Another important concept is gratitude. I know common vocabulary says we take photos. Well, actually, we receive photos. This photo was a gift. It's impossible to imagine that I would say, could you just hold that pose right there above that flower, just like that? Could you wait? Wait a minute, I need to move a bit. No, this is luck. This is a gift. And the same thing here. There's no way you could ask these birds to pose like that. You have to be there at the right time so that you can receive this. Now, as with any collection of gifts, You may sometimes receive gifts that are different from what you want, but you're still grateful. And if anything, here's a bird that's completely immersed in its job. And then, of course, we need a camera. But I realize, and I hear this, there's a lot of controversy over cameras. Please, any camera is better than no camera, even a cell phone, a shoebox if you want to make a pinhole camera, although realize a shoebox has a low frame rate and some other limitations. Okay, well, I want to talk about photography as a blend of craft, art, and you. And I'll spend most of the time talking about it as craft because through this, I'll be sharing techniques and tips, tricks, if you will, that you can use to take better photos of hummingbirds and, in fact, of just about anything that you care to take photos of. Wildlife, wild kids, whatever. So let's begin with craft. Craft has to do with the mechanics, and that answers the question, what does what? So let's begin mechanics with knowing what to set, and we'll begin with the most important control on the camera, which is the shutter button. Now, this is important. For example, if I were out taking photos of this hummingbird, I would bracket focus. That means I would focus here, and then I'd move the focus square or spot a little and focus here, and I'd focus here. And even if I was using the Canon R5, which has animal recognition allows the camera to find and then focus on the eye. I will still be taking bursts of photos marching around on the bird. Why would I do this? Well, we live in a real world. This bird is breathing. There might be a breeze. And so it's dynamic. Things are moving. And I'm hoping, and in fact, from experience, I know that if I can take a dozen photos of this bird while it's perched like this, there will be sometimes only one, that's significantly better than the others, has better feather detail, better sharpness. Second tip, to the extent possible, move closer. And this does require some care. So I was at the Arboretum and I took this photo of an Anna's hummingbird female. And you may notice that the focus square touches plant elements. So if I zoom in, I end up with this photo. Well, I crept up on the bird. And by crept up, I mean, I spent minutes, like 3, 4, 5 minutes, moving just about 4 or 5 feet. It took a long time. There were times when I even walked sideways without looking at the bird. My point was, excuse me, I wanted to move so slowly that the bird did not recognize that I was moving closer to it. The value in this is I could put the focus square so it completely covered the bird. And when I did that, you notice I have a better photo, better detail. Another tip is to consider the difference between press versus squeeze. I've seen people holding a small compact camera, they put their finger on the shutter button and they press, and you notice the camera moves. Well, if the camera moves while the shutter clicks, that's going to cause a blurry photo. So instead, excuse me, you can squeeze. And that means you put a finger above, below, like this, and you squeeze. And in doing that, you equalize the force on the camera, and that minimizes camera movement. Now, instead of just hand holding the camera, I strongly recommend using a solid support, such as a tripod, or maybe a monopod. And if that's not available, anything. There are times when I've been out, excuse me, hold on. These human moments make life so interesting. There are times when I've leaned against a tree and put the camera up against a tree so that I could have a solid, more stable connection with the camera to minimize movement. And another tip is to use a cable release. And that's what I did here. Here was a hummingbird that was visiting our yard, and I focused on it using live view, and then I used a cable release. In this case, I had no physical interaction with the camera, and I was able to take this photo, and you can notice it has wonderful sharp detail. Camera controls number 2. There are 2 types of files, RAW files and JPEG. The RAW file consists of the data collected by the camera, and so it's a larger file. The JPEG consists of the data that have been processed by the camera to give you a smaller compressed file. So I recommend using JPEG if possible. And if you must use, I recommend using RAW if possible. If you must use JPEG, use the highest quality JPEG that your camera will allow. Use a maximum frame size. Some cameras allow you to set different frame sizes. So if your camera has 4/3, use 4/3. If it has 3.2, use 3.2. And then avoid digital zoom, because when you do this, you're cropping the image in the camera, and that's giving you a smaller data file. And avoid in-camera processing, because this is tampering with the image you took, and I think you would prefer to perform your own processing with software afterwards. So let's reframe it, because actually you are collecting data instead of taking photos, and you want to collect as much good data as possible. Camera controls number 3. These are the 3 standard the 3 standard groups of controls: ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and exposure compensation. I set them in this order. I set the ISO first based on the situation. And the big difference would be whether it's a perched bird or I'm out looking for or taking photos of flying birds. Exposure, that means composition. And by composition, how much depth of field I want. Usually with hummingbirds, I want very little depth of field. And then exposure compensation is a correction that we make to bring in the best possible exposure. Let's start with ISO. ISO is a measure of your camera sensitivity. That means at low ISO, you will need more light to take the same photo that you would need at high ISO. In general, you would use low ISO for better quality, and that's because the curve of quality versus ISO looks like this, and you'd prefer to be working where the quality is optimum. So you would then save high ISO for special situations, and note that when you're out at the end of the highest ISO, the quality degrades rapidly. Let's compare the difference. Here is a photo of a hummingbird at low ISO, and here's the same bird, high ISO. Do you notice the difference in image quality? Do you notice the background is grainy and the details are muted? So here is an assignment. Determine ISO versus quality for your camera system. And you can do this easily by taking something fixed, like a plant or an object, and then taking photos over a range of ISO, comparing them and deciding at which ISO you've reached the limit of what you consider acceptable. Another way to do this is to put the lens cap on the camera, take a series of photos at different ISO, and when you notice white specks appearing in the photo, that's indicating the onset of noise, which means, again, you're reaching the kind of the tipping point of when you've gone too far. Aperture controls depth of field. So you would use large apertures to emphasize. For example, here is a photo taken with a large aperture, and you notice we emphasize the bird. Now at f5.6 with the camera system I'm using, the depth of field is the order of millimeters, like 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch. And that's okay because this is a small bird, and you see the photo is quite acceptable. We would use small apertures to show more depth. And so if I wanted to include more background, I'd use a smaller aperture like f11. And you notice how more of the background is apparent. But as I said, with hummingbirds, I prefer a small depth of field because usually I want a very simple background. And here, I think the background is competing with the bird. Shutter speed is a measure of how long the shutter is open. So we use high shutter speeds to freeze action and low shutter speeds, possibly for special effects or when that's really the best we can manage. So here's an example of a photo taken with a high shutter speed. And you notice I'm able to capture some detail in the hummingbird's wings. Here's the same hummingbird at a slower shutter speed, and notice what happened to the wings. They're blurred. And here's a photo of a Rivoli's hummingbird, male, at a low shutter speed. The bird's sharp and in focus, but the wings are blurred. So in general, you would use the highest ISO and the largest aperture possible to obtain the fastest shutter speed, because that will serve you the best with moving birds and even with perched birds. These little birds are breathing at like 100 plus times a minute. So they're like little vibrators, and you need to freeze that action with a high shutter speed. Exposure compensation is where you touch up to bring in good exposure. The process is take some photos and then check them, or check the histogram and make adjustments. If you were to see me in the field, you would notice that I'm always stopping and checking the photos that I've taken for their exposure. And if need be, then I'll make adjustments with exposure compensation. Now, what's the histogram? The histogram is a plot that shows the number of pixels at each level of light, and it goes from dark to light. It's important to recognize most of the data are collected at the light end. Now that makes sense because our eyes are more sensitive to variations in bright tones. We're less sensitive to variations in dark tones. And if you need to, you can even bring in shadows a bit using software, whereas it's very, very difficult to create lost detail at the bright end of the scale. So if you're taking a photo and you have a histogram like that, that represents a well-exposed photo, and you notice it pinches out at both ends, especially the bright end. If the photo were dark, underexposed, we can correct that by increasing EV, which increases processor sensitivity and thereby increasing the brightness on the photo. On the other hand, if it's too bright, overexposed, then we can decrease the EV or decrease processor sensitivity and bring the photo back into what would be a well-exposed photo. Well, the next part of photography is knowing when to press. And here are considerations. I'll admit that I don't take photos of birds. And I know that might sound absurd because I've been showing you photos of birds. I don't look on it as taking photos of birds. I look on it as taking photos of eyes. So I focus on the eye, and I want eyes that are sharp. I want eyes that are alive. That means they have a catch light. They have, a glimmer of light on it. It looks alive. And ideally, I want the eye to be looking at you. The other aspect is choosing the head angle. Now, here is an excellent photo of a broad-billed hummingbird male. But notice the difference between this photo and this photo. I think the second photo is more interesting because in this photo, the bird seems to be looking at you. It's the difference between having a conversation with someone who's looking at you in the eye or looking off to the side. It's a better conversation. And I want people to have a conversation with the bird in my photo. This even applies at a distance. Here's a hummingbird perched on the top of a tree, but when it turned down toward me, it improves the photo and even creates the illusion that the bird is perhaps lower and even maybe closer. Now, head angle can be mapped into body language. And you can imagine somebody giving you different head angles while you're talking to them, like, okay, well, we can do the same thing with our photos. We can give them some personality by choosing different head angles. So here's the Allen's hummingbird, the male, and here's the female. You notice each of these photos conveys a different impression, maybe a different story. And then here are two very special hummingbirds, the violet-crowned hummingbird and the Rivole's hummingbird. And this is a male junior, so he's just growing into the adult plumage. Well, then the next part is where to wait. And this brings us to two situations, which are perched and flying. So let's talk about perched hummingbirds first. This can be relatively easy because you notice this is a video, but my goodness, if the bird will stay still or stay in one place like this, you have minutes when you can take photos. And the good part of this is hummingbirds are creatures of habit. So if you're out in a garden, you may notice a hummingbird finds a perch and it keeps going back to it. It might leave to go feed on flowers, then it'll go back to the same branch. So all you have to do is set up and wait. And in fact, that's my photo process for birds. I will go to where they are and then I wait. And after a while, the birds and everybody forget that I'm there. And, you know, sometimes it's surprising. I once had a red-winged blackbird walk under my tripod. So that's an indication that I had stood there so long, so still, that I was about, you know, I was as safe as the trees in the area. You know, a bird walked right under the tripod. Now, when you're taking photos of perched birds or any birds, think of 4 points. First of all, there's you. And I'm going to assume that you're happy and having a good time out there. And then, of course, there's the bird. Third is the sun. Ideally, you, the sun, and the bird are in line. Now, sometimes when I'm out, I'll hold my hands like this. And I'm doing that to look at where they fall on where the shadow falls. And I'm aiming that zone between my hands at the bird. And that's because I want the light behind me shining flat on the bird. If you do that, you can take photos like this of this broad-billed hummingbird. You notice flat, even light, no shadows, beautiful detail. Now, I did say 4 points. Well, the fourth point is the background. And the background is important because it holds the image that you capture. So ideally, you want these 4 in line. Backgrounds can be tricky. Now, these are 4 backgrounds that would work when they're far away from the hummingbird. And by far, I mean 20, 30 feet or so. And if you're using a large enough aperture, these they'll blur. Consider this one. This background blurred into this beautiful rich green. It's interesting to note, I took this photo early morning when the sun was low in the sky, so I have flat light on that tree. Later in the day, like just before lunch, when the sun was high in the sky, there were pockets of shade in the tree. And those pockets of shade gave this type of background. And, you know, we can feel grateful that this bird perched on the same branch in the same place so that we can have this comparison. Well, I was at the Arboretum once and I found this Anna's hummingbird, the female, and I took this photo. And then all I did was move about a foot to my right and I could take this photo. And then I moved another foot and I took this photo. And you notice, by moving just a couple of feet, I improved the quality of the background. This is more even, more uniform. It provides more contrast. It just makes a nicer photo. And then here's a photo of a hummingbird perched on the hibiscus. And so how did we get a blue background here? Well, in this case, since this was in my backyard, I provided a background. I took a piece of cloth, attached it to cardboard, and pinned it to the creeping fig that's on the block wall with clothespins. And clothespins are a wonderful tool because it's a non-destructive way of causing a small adjustment in the environment. Let's talk about flying hummingbirds. To illustrate the challenge, I have a sequence of photos, 10 photos. They're going to show 1 second apart. They were taken with a camera that will take 10 frames a second. So the sequence of 10 photos you're going to see happened in 1 second. And I left the hummingbird feeder here as a reference so that you could compare that with the bird's movement. So this is what you're dealing with a flying hummingbird. Let's go. Okay, all of that happens in 1 second, which is an indication of how quickly these little birds move. Again, 4 points apply. So you want to line up the sun, you, the bird, and a good background. Camera settings, I recommend high shutter speeds, at least 1/2000th of a second. And in fact, I prefer 1/5000th or faster. If your camera has a burst mode or a sport mode, use that because it's physically impossible to predict where the bird will be and focus on it while it's moving about. Birds can react in 1/100th of a second. The best athletes can react in about 1/10th of a second. The rest of us are probably in the second mode. So you need burst mode to blanket the area where the bird is. And then use predictive focus. And this is a feature in some cameras where the camera will track or continue to focus on a moving subject. In the Canon world, it's called AI servo. In Nikon, it's called continuous. Other brands may name it something else. And then if your camera has face recognition, I'm using a Canon R5 now, which is this animal recognition capability. It's absolutely incredible. That will find the bird's eye and focus on it and stay focused on it. Now, there are 2 ways to do this, and probably the easiest is to find a flower. These are plants that are growing at the Arboretum, and one season, you notice it looked like this. It was useful because, first of all, you could focus on the plant to check exposure. You could also practice focusing on the plant, and by doing that, now you're ready so that when a bird comes to that plant to feed, you're already in focus or almost in focus. And now it's simply a matter of your camera focusing on the bird that appears near it. And then, and this is going to happen, if the bird flies away and your camera refocuses, you can return to your focus point by using that flower. So this was the flower system. And by using that, I was able to take photos like this. Now you'll notice I put the flower element to the side of the frame so that I could take photos like this. Also at the Arboretum, there was Pride of Madeira one season, and I was able to take photos of this Anna's hummingbird and photos of an Allen's that was hovering over cactus flowers. Framing is important. Suppose you want to take a photo like this. Well, I recommend stepping back and leaving room to crop. And the reason is, as you saw earlier, while that bird is in this zone, it's going to be all over the area. And so that's what I did when I was taking photos here. I focused on this New Mexico thistle. I'm stepped back a ways. And when the hummingbird came in, I was able to take this photo. And then with software, I can crop to have this. And I did the same thing here. Now, another approach is to set up a feeder. And then you can take photos like this, and you can even use software then to heal or clone away the feeder. And I've done that with some of the photos. Although I'll admit, depending on the framing and so on, it can be a chore to remove a feeder from a photo like this. When you set up a feeder, set up the perch for a good head angle. And in fact, if it's your yard and your feeder, you can block all the ports except the one port that you want the hummingbirds to go to. Now, I want to emphasize if it's your yard and your feeder. And that's because there was someone who allowed a photographer to come into her yard, and this resident, this person had more than a dozen feeders set up in her yard. It was just a magnificent hummingbird destination. Well, the photographer put tape over all the ports on all the feeders except the one he wanted. And as a result, hundreds of hummingbirds went into chaos. She was mad enough to post this guy's photo in the post office. He was not going to be invited back. So you can take photos like this, bird perched on the feeder. Another trick is to attach a branch. And the reason is hummingbirds will feed and then they'll perch and they'll rest for the 5 to 10 minutes between feedings. Well, if you're set to take photos of flying hummingbirds coming to this feeder and you have a branch, now you have two possibilities. You can take photos of them while they perch and you can take photos of them while they're on the branch. So here we are. When you set up feeders, set them at least 5 feet above the ground. And the reason for that is the common house cat is one of the few predators that can catch a hummingbird. And if a feeder is low, the cat will just crouch below it. And when a hummingbird comes in, it goes and catches the bird. So we need to protect the birds. We also can put the feeder near flowers. And we do that because the birds come for the flowers and they stay for the feeder. We feed them both ways. A feeder that I like is this little test tube feeder. It's just a small feeder, so it's easy to clone out of a photo. And you can see it has a red cap with a small hole in it. Now, note, I have set this up to optimize the head angle. Now, this photo shows the hummingbird with its bill in the feeder, and you'll end up taking many photos like that. However, when the bird backs up, you can take photos like this because they will come and hover and in front of the feeder. And just another example, I did this in our backyard. So there's a photo. When you choose a feeder, choose feeders that are easy to clean because they need to be cleaned every 2 to 3 days. And choose feeders without reflections. There are some really pretty feeders, although the reflections will interfere with the quality of your photos. And then when you're choosing hummingbird food, it's really simple. 4 parts water, 1 part cane sugar. And I want to emphasize just plain ordinary cane sugar. I once bought organic sugar and it was brown. Now, I might use that for our own cooking, but it's not going to be optimum for hummingbirds. Cane sugar is perfectly safe for hummingbirds. So 4 parts water, 1 part cane sugar. That's 4 cups of water, 1 cup of sugar. So we're going to make hummingbird food using 4 parts water, 1 part cane sugar. And I know I'm really bearing on this, but my point is no brown sugar. Reason is brown sugar contains iron. That's toxic for hummingbirds. No molasses. Molasses contains brown sugar. No honey. Honey contains bacteria that's toxic for hummingbirds. Why am I mentioning this? Because I've heard people brag about using these things, and those are all bad for hummingbirds. So we just need water and cane sugar. And it's embarrassing to show this list, but all of these are ingredients that people have told me that they used. Artificial sweeteners. Come on. They don't need to lose weight. The hummingbird will eat twice its body weight in nectar a day. And they're doing that because they need the nutrition. No food dyes. Food dyes are toxic. And if you doubt that, drink a cup of green food dye before you go to sleep and check what you look like in the morning. I mean, assuming you wake up, it's terrible. No food dyes, no flavors. They don't matter. It's a waste of money. No fragrances, waste of money. Preservatives. You're going to clean the feeders every 2 to 3 days. Waste of money, toxic. No vitamins. They don't need vitamins. They get their vitamins by eating bugs. In fact, a hummingbird's diet consists of about 10% bugs. And then this is appalling. No soft drinks, no Kool-Aid. I mean, these are birds, not people. You want to feed them food that's good for them. If you set up native flowers, use native plants. And that's because those are the plants that the birds expect to find in your area. They're also going to be easier to care for, and no chemicals. Chemicals destroy plants that birds and other wildlife use for food, and they destroy the bugs. And as I said, hummingbirds need bugs. In fact, at a hummingbird festival, there was a company selling a little container that you could put a banana peel in so that the banana peel would rot and attract small bugs for the hummingbirds. So, you can just imagine a buggy yard is a happy yard. Well, another consideration is working with light. And that's because photography is the art of sculpting with light. So here's a photo of a Rivelli's hummingbird, and the photo has two problems. The gorget is overexposed, and the body is underexposed. Now I realize, people might say, this guy's complaining about a photo of a flying Rivelli's hummingbird. Well, yes, because we can do better. Another challenge is you can have shadows. And, it's better than no photo, and yet the shadow detracts from the photo. So how do we do this? Well, ideally or conceptually, we want the bird and the background to be inside the dynamic range for your camera. What that means in practical terms is that if you're taking photos of a bird that's bright, we want it to be against a bright background. And notice that works well for flying hummingbirds because bright light lets you use higher shutter speeds. So here we have a black-chinned hummingbird. It's a male and it's a juvenile. Here's the adult male, 1/5000th of a second. Both of these photos were taken with bright light on the bird, bright light on the background. Here's a rufous hummingbird female. Notice how bright the background is compared to the bird. So bright light, bright bird works especially well for flying hummingbirds. Now, soft light can also be good. And the reason it's good is that the gorget, and that's this throat area on a hummingbird, is extremely bright when the light shines on it. In soft light, now that gorget, the bird in the background are all within a close enough dynamic range so that you can take a workable photo. And then we can even do something as perhaps odd as take photos on cloudy days, evenings, and shade. And here are some examples. I took this photo in the shade, low shutter speed, but I was able to capture the bird with good detail. And this is a broad-billed hummingbird, the male. Here's a juvenile male, shade. In fact, I took this when it was drizzling outside. Here's a female. I took this photo at Morro Bay, and I went out there on cloudy days specifically to take this photo. And I did that because in the cloudy light, the soft cloudy light, I was able to capture the gorget with this detail. I took this photo of the bird when it was raining. I stood under the patio cover, and here's this bird perched on a plant. And you could tell the bird just does not seem to look happy. And, low shutter speed. I took this photo of a rufous hummingbird that stopped in our yard while it was migrating through our area. And again, low shutter speed. I took this photo after sunset using a very low shutter speed, but because I'm on a tripod and with good camera technique, making sure I'm solid, I was able to capture good detail. Well, that's mechanics. Let's take a look at art. And art asks us what goes where. So let's take a quick course on graphic design. And it begins by recognizing we read from left to right, which means Well, it's difficult to read that, isn't it? We don't read from right to left. Golly. Well, you may have noticed all my hummingbirds are placed in the same part of the frame, facing the same way. And the reason I'm doing that is I want your eye to come in from the left, which is where it would typically enter a frame or a page, and meet the bird. And then once your eye meets the bird, I want it to travel around on the bird so that ideally the form of the bird holds your eye in the frame. The point here is you want to design photos that catch and hold the viewer's eye. And then there's more. In graphic design, there's positive space. That's the space occupied by the subject, the bird. And there's negative space. Negative space serves to frame the subject. And so you notice I've allowed negative space, which occupies almost a third of the whole frame. And I've arranged it so that the bird is moving into the negative space. That creates an image that just logically makes sense. It's better than having the bird leave the frame, flying out, and taking your eye with it off the page. Okay. Now I realize at this point, there has to be at least someone out there who's thinking, hey, what do I do if the bird's on the other side of the frame? Well, that's easy. We use software to flip it. And I realize once someone knows how to do that, they might go too far. Well, we all know that flowers don't grow down from the sky. So, just to honor science, we're going to have photos like this. Well, the last part of photography is you. And that answers the question, what do you show? You see, when you take photos, you're actually engaging in a process of personal expression. You're showing your brand. You're creating a legacy. By legacy, imagine that it's 100 years from now, and people find a collection of your photos. Based on just seeing those photos, what could they tell about you? And if you let your mind play with this, it might be a lot. So your photos actually contain your signature because it's there through, well, the photos that you're showing. Now your signature, well, it begins with the photos that you choose to take. And so here is a sequence from one outing. And my point here is there'll be times when I do not take a photo because what I see in the viewfinder is outside the bounds of what I would consider part of my signature. And then it continues through what you keep. So I'll throw out a whole bunch of photos that are just inconsistent with my signature. And then finally, it appears with what you choose to show. Now, you may recognize well, let's pick this one. And there we are. And the reason I'm making this point is if you know what you're trying to do, if you know what you're trying to accomplish, if you know the story that you're trying to tell, then you'll be more effective in how you go about doing that. Well, I hope these ideas are useful. I hope this presentation inspires you to go out, to spend some time in nature, to visit the Fullerton Arboretum if you're in the area. And if you travel to Southern California, put this on your list. It's a beautiful, wonderful spot. It's an island of habitat surrounded by everything else that's here. And you can just go for a delightful stroll among the plants and the wildlife, mostly the birds that are in there. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I'd like to remind you, here's my website. And if you have questions or anything you'd like to talk about after this program, there's my email address. And of course, my contact information is all over my website. So I wish you the very best as you go out and enjoy taking photos of hummingbirds. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, we now can go answer some of the questions. So please, if you have any questions or comments, place them in the chat box. I'll be also be checking the question and answer box if you want to type them there. But Steve, thank you. Steve is it's a big supporter of the Arboretum. He's also a member, and he has donated his time and knowledge with this presentation. So Steve, thank you for keep supporting us. And if you'd like to support us too, please visit our website fullertonarboretum.org, and please consider donations. Anyways, let's check out the question, Steve. Let me read it for you. So
Sure,
somebody made a comment early on if you could address iPhone photography.
sure. Well, first of all, any camera is better than no camera. And even the simplest smartphones have cameras, and with them, you can take photos of hummingbirds. In fact, if you're really still, for example, if you have a hummingbird feeder and you just stand very, very still, or you sit on a stool, sit on a chair, you can take photos that are wonderful. We've been outside on our patio, and we might be having a conversation, eating an apple or something like that. There have been hummingbirds that have stopped just a couple of feet away from us. And if I had an iPhone ready, if I had my iPhone ready, I could do this. And, most, well, at least I'm going to guess the better phones have a burst mode. So use the burst mode and just blanket the space with photos. You'll probably be surprised with what you catch. So it's doable. It's just mad. It requires that you're very, very quiet and a bit patient.
All right, next question is it possible to watch this recording again? The answer is yes. This has been recorded, and as soon as it's edited, we'll have it ready, and you will receive a link through the email that you registered for this presentation. Um, Next comment is thank you for this informative presentation. Here's the question: how do we get copy of the record? Okay, I just answered that. Here's a question. I guess it's for the Arboretum. Does the Arboretum require photo permit to take pictures with a tripod? Well, the answer is you can come and you're welcome to take photos of nature. You don't need a photo permit. The only time that we ask for a photo permit is when you're using the Arboretum as a backdrop. So for that, you would need a permit. But if you're just taking pictures of nature, you don't need one. Another comment just came in, Steve. Great presentation. Many thanks for your time.
Miguel, let
Yes,
me add,
please.
when you say use the arboretum as a backdrop, that means you, a photographer, come in with subjects like a wedding couple or a graduation, and you're using it as a backdrop for professional photography. And I've seen people bring in studio lights,
Yes.
reflectors. They bring a wagon load of equipment. They're basically using the arboretum as a photo studio. And there are many beautiful scenic spots in the Arboretum that serve really well for very special occasion photos. And that's what that's where this applies.
Yes, and the photo, just to stress this a little bit, the photo permit, I mean, it helps the Arboretum as well. It costs money to open the Arboretum with staff, and it takes money to keep to take care of the plants. So, photo permits they do help a lot. So if you do have something like I don't know, wedding or graduation or whatever it is that you want to use the background, yeah, please consider getting a photo permit. But if it's just nature, please come and enjoy the arena. Again, it'll be open on the 6th for members and donors, and on the 7th for it'll be open to the public. So hope to see you guys there. Let me see. Is there any? Thank you,
Let me
Stephen, Miguel.
mention,
Okay.
I when you remember the photos of the very tall white flowers. Well, when those were in bloom and hummingbirds were coming to them, I sent notice to other photographers. And at one time, there were like a half dozen of us with our tripods, all clustered in the right zone so that we had the good light behind us. And we're just clicking away because there were like a dozen or so of these white flowers. So anybody could pick one of them and just wait for hummingbirds to come to it.
Here's another comment, Steve. Thank you, Steve and Miguel, for this fabulous program. That's actually Jay. Jay, thank you also for donating your time and with those two workshops that you offer. So thank you for your support, Jay, and thank you for coming and attending this one as well.
Cool.
All right. Well, if there's no more comments or questions, you can. Oh, here's another one. Do you assume lenses, Steve?
Ah, well, I use what works. So it depends. Yes, I use zoom lenses, and often I will have it zoomed out as far as possible. Um, I'm moving to mirrorless cameras. Before I had the Canon 100 to 400 zoom lens. Otherwise, I was using the Canon 600 millimeter f4, and then I'd put a 1.4 extender on it. If I'm using a full frame camera, that gave me 840 millimeter. If I was using a crop sensor camera, and in the Canon world, that's 1.6, I would have a focal length of 1344 millimeter, which gives me really a large reach. Now I have recently bought the 100 to 500 millimeter zoom lens, and I'm using that on the Canon R5. Now, I noticed someone asked, explain mirrorless lenses. Actually, it's mirrorless camera bodies. So let's take this apart. There are different types of cameras. There are point and click cameras, and those point and click cameras are mirrorless. That means the light goes in and just goes directly to the sensor. If you have an optical viewfinder, it's a little LCD driven type screen, or you would frame using the LCD screen on the back of the camera. An iPhone is a mirrorless camera. There are also digital SLRs, and those are cameras that had a mirror inside the camera so that light would come in, strike the mirror, go through a prism to the optical viewfinder. When you press the shutter, the camera would flip the mirror out of the way so that the light could go through and strike the processor, or in the old days, strike the film. They are now making, I suppose you could call it, large, sophisticated, and expensive point and click cameras, and they call them mirrorless. But it means there's no mirror. The light just goes in directly to processors. And if you look through the optical viewfinder, you see basically an LCD type image. Someone asked what editing software I'm using. I'm using Capture One. And I chose, well, there's a whole story on why I chose that. I'll admit that it's a high-end professional grade editing software, and it does really an exceptional job. However, use what you have. If you have a Mac, there's Photos. My wife uses Photos. It's simple, it's easy to use. An iPhone even has its own editing software in it. So you can use that. Another software consideration is made by Affinity. Affinity is makes software, photo processing software. Depending on whether they have a promotion or not, it can cost as little as 50 to 100 bucks. And then there's Adobe. My concern about Adobe is that their software is subscription based. And that means if you want to use it, you have to subscribe. When you stop subscribing, you're unable to process any of the photos you took. And I want to own software, so I'm buying Capture One. I probably gave you a larger answer than you expected. Someone asked what type of tripod you use. Some of this depends upon how big your system is. I'm now using a carbon fiber tripod that weighs about 3 pounds. So you might look for that type of range. They make tripods in different series. Series 1 will be the smallest, Series 2 a little larger, Series 3 still larger, and larger implies more weight and more cost. I'd recommend going to a camera store and even picking up the tripods and finding one that makes sense. I had a tripod that was a Series 3. It weighed almost 5 pounds. And then I had a gimbal head on it that weighed almost 4 pounds. So if you add that up, there's 9 pounds of weight before I put the camera and the lens on it. You know, at one time, I'm carrying almost 20 pounds worth of gear. That's a lot. And as you get older, you become more sensitive to weight. I hope I'm answering your question. If you want to talk about it more, send me an email or call me up.
And now that you mention email, I just posted mine in the chat, mimacias at fullerton.edu. If you have any questions regarding the Arboretum or this workshop, please send me an email and I'll be happy to pass it down to Steve if I don't have the answer. And also, you can contact Steve at stevekaye.com. Is that correct, Steve?
Yes, the website, well, here, I'll just let me mouse down to the comment field. And I can do this easily because I have snippets, or, yep, there we are.
Awesome.
That's how to find me. My website has a lot of information on it. There are over 600 photos there. There are 143 blog posts. There are articles on there about photography as well as leadership and life topics. And that's because between 1992 and about 2011, I worked as a professional speaker teaching leadership skills. So I would go to corporations and conduct workshops on how to hold meetings, how to get along, how to plan and set goals and so on.
So, Steve, did you see this comment? Make sure to send it to everyone, not just the panelists. Mine says all panelists. How about yours?
Well, let me change that.
I see it to all panelists. So,
and chat to panelists and attendees.
yeah.
Let's try this.
Okay.
It's good that there are people there.
Yes. There we go.
I'm glad that someone out there is paying attention and having the courage to speak up.
All right, Steve, it's 11:59. Thank you. Great talk. Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you.
All
Thanks
right,
for coming.
Steve. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming in. Hopefully we'll see you at the Arboretum soon.
And Miguel, thank you for your support.
Thank you, Steve, for all your support and everything you do.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.